the founding of the country to the present day, America has found a constant source of enrichment in the many diverse gifts brought to it by the immigrants.
KTCA TV, St. Paul, Minneapolis presents Ireland Rediscovered, a series of 13 programs dealing with the significance of the Irish nation, which has emerged to statehood in our own times. Dr. John McKiernan, head of the Department of English at the College of St. Thomas in St. Paul, and an authority on Ireland, is our host and instructor. The program, The Golden Door, is taken from the poem at the base of the Statue of Liberty. Here again is Professor McKiernan.
You may well wonder why we should have a series of programs entitled Ireland Rediscovered. You may feel that enough is known about Ireland, or you may feel that too much is known about Ireland. But it's one of those curious quirks of history, because Ireland, modern Ireland, is a product of something that happened in our time, something possibly that was forecast by that great American seer, that great American poet, Walter Whitman. You may remember one of the poems in which he predicted that the future would see an untold new number of nations emerging. New combinations of nations he spoke of too. At the beginning of the 20th century, Ireland was in a very sad plight. And had her condition continued, no one today would have the slightest interest in Ireland. Something happened. Ireland became a state scarcely 40 years ago, and in becoming a state, achieved an identity of her own, and became something with which we had to concern ourselves. Just as, for instance, we must today think about the African nations, whereas 10 years ago we cared little indeed for Africa. Such then is the reason, I suppose, for this series of informational programs, Ireland Rediscovered, because indeed we may know far less about Ireland than we think. And in this particular program, I should like to talk to you about the Irish in America. The most common term applied to our country is the melting pot. And curiously enough, as often as we apply this, we very, very seldom think of what came out of the melting pot or what went into the melting pot. We think only of that conglomerate mass, the melting pot. But I suppose partly due to 20th century conditions, the fact that we have, for instance, had so many emerging states in this century, we have come to appreciate the contributions made by foreigners to this country of ours. Therefore, we can appreciate the words on the base of that Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. And through that golden door have walked countless numbers of immigrants, Germans, Scandinavians, Italians, Poles, Portuguese, Spanish, African, Asiatic, and not the least, the Irish. I should like then to talk to you during this program about their particular contribution in this country of ours. It's extraordinarily interesting that Ireland has rather ancient associations, at least traditionally and in a legendary sense, with America. Few of you will have at your fingertips the story of St. Brendan the Navigator, but this was a very popular medieval tale, Navigatio Brendani, the Voyage of Brendan. The voyage reputed to have taken place during the 6th century, when St. Brendan sailed westward and touched upon the shores of America. I'm not here today to present this as historical evidence. I might add that in the 19th century, Historians were very fond about arguing about the authenticity of this. I present it simply as a traditional and ancient association. In fact, it is the oldest European association with this country. We might also mention, while we're on tradition, that a rather strong tradition associates Columbus with America in this respect, that he had aboard a sailor, William of Galway. On the other hand, there is indisputable evidence, indisputable historical evidence, that the Irish were here from the very founding of the country. Contemporary documents from the 17th century indicate that the Irish were already in Maryland and Virginia. Colonial documents, for instance, Governor Winthrop's diary or Cotton Mather's sermons make mention of the Irish in New England. So that we know that long before the Revolutionary War, there were tens of thousands of Irish in America. In fact, they had already given their names to many of the towns of our country. Waterford, Dublin, Cork, Antrim, Sligo, Belfast, Neenah, and many other names which provided for them the reminder of their homes. Now, before I go very deeply or in great detail into the story of the Irish in America, I should like to present to you 2 points which you might bear in mind during the course of this discussion. The first is that Europe's difficulty has always been America's opportunity. It's just as true today, for instance. Our rocketry research, for instance, has benefited in this respect. But Europe's difficulty has always been America's opportunity. The people who have had to leave Europe for reasons of political, economic, religious, racial persecution have not come empty-handed to us. They have come bearing gifts. And certainly during the 3 centuries that we're talking about during this program, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th centuries, it is a matter of history that Ireland was suffering strangulation at the hands of England. Political, economic, and in some sense, in a certain sense at any rate, religious. And the Irish who came here then, like other Europeans who came here, brought with them gifts. That is the first point I should like you to remember. The second is that in the history of this Irish immigration, something very decisive happened about 1850. Although the Irish had been coming for 200 years before that, about 1850, their numbers increased so drastically that certain reactions were inevitable. Well, for the details then, I think I have indicated to you sufficiently from the documents which I might read from, but which would take us too much time tonight, that the Irish were here in the 17th century. They were here as teachers, they were here as farmers, they were here as merchants. We might even mention, of course, that Governor Dongan, the colonial governor of New York in 1682, was Irish. But let it suffice that they were here in representative numbers and in representative walks of life. During the 18th century, we find them here as teachers, legislators, and generally speaking, we might call champions of independence. You know, it's very interesting to read, for instance, in some of these older books. Here is a quotation, I have copied it out for ease. Writing in 1789, a South Carolina historian, David Ramsey, had this to say about the Irish. For the last 70 or 80 years, no nation has contributed so much to the population as Ireland. This wasn't all to the ease of the Irish, because they came here with a particular brand of republicanism, with a particular interest in freedom, independence, which wasn't always welcome. Now, for instance, the loyalist Bishop of Londonderry spoke of them as fanatical Republicans, and he abhorred them. Another man whom we might quote from this period, David Galloway, In testifying at a British parliamentary investigation into the causes of the American Revolution, David Galloway said that half of the army of Washington was Irish, which of course was rather ridiculous, but it does indicate, you see, the fact that the Irish were credited, if you will, with being troublemakers, with wanting freedom, with trying to separate the colony from the mother. And we might remind you of a letter of Horace Walpole, which was written at a time when America was experiencing her darkest days. And in his letter, written June 25th, 1776, Walpole wrote, "All Ireland is America mad." On the other hand, Ireland provided more than soldiers for America. Irish thinking, for instance, went into the very philosophy of freedom. When it comes to the Declaration of Independence, Irish-born and the sons of Irish-born appended their names to that document, as this plaque, which is now to be found on the City Hall of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, testifies. Names there, for instance, like Colonel James Smith, Edward Rutledge, George Taylor, Matthew Thornton, are the names of Irish-born. Other names on there are the names of sons of Irish-born. Well, when it comes to the Constitution, for instance, you recall the French critic of our early days, Alexis de Tocqueville. And de Tocqueville had something to say about the origins of the Constitution. In his opinion, one man created it, Rutledge. Now here is an example of father and son united in one common enterprise, the freedom of this country, and associating themselves in a most important way with it, and motivated, if you will, by the father's burning desire, his burning interest in justice, his desire to see it in his adopted country. I might, for instance, again, take another book. Douglas Campbell here has written, "By the Irish, American independence was first openly advocated, and but for their efforts, seconding those of the New England Puritans, that independence would not have been secured." So we may say that before the end of the 18th century, the Irish had certainly earned their citizenship. Let us, however, look to the arts of peace, not merely those of war. Were the sons of Ireland able to contribute in a peaceful way to the development of this country, or were they merely the dissatisfied rabble who could so easily lend themselves to excitement? Well, I should present to you, for instance, a man who isn't sufficiently appreciated today, Christopher Collies, who, before his arrival here in 1776, had been the director of navigation on the River Shannon. During the American Revolutionary War, he had lent his services to the Continental Army as an instructor in artillery. After the war, he had spent a great deal of time inventing useful, and indeed a contemporary account calls them ingenious contrivances, but useful contrivances, useful machines for the peaceful economy. Possibly one of his greatest benefits was the plan that he drew up for the system of waterworks for the city of New York. There's so much to point to in his life. Before his death, he became superintendent of the American Academy of Fine Arts. He was also instrumental in proposing the canal, which later became the Erie Canal. In fact, in 1785, he published a book in which he made certain proposals and recommendations for opening up the West. It's very interesting that the Irish should have been associated with canals. They knew them at home, and they recognized that the new country, the new republic, was very dependent upon its means of communication. And if its commerce and enterprise were to grow, something would have to be done. A great many Irish were interested in canals, and a great many of them dug and otherwise worked on as supervisors, laborers, and in other ways worked upon these canals. It's very interesting that Robert Fulton, who was the son of Irish immigrants, should also have been very, very much interested in canals. Today we don't appreciate the importance of these canals to our early economy. And possibly I might remark that it was in the governorship of DeWitt Clinton, himself a descendant of Irish immigrants from County Longford, that canal that opened up the West was finally built. I might mention not only canal builders and canal proposers, but men like Matthew Carey, the Philadelphia man who had to escape from his native Dublin because of the stinging attack that he had written against the English rule in Ireland. Coming here within a year, he had established a newspaper, the Pennsylvania Herald. Within 3 years, he had established what became the leading periodical of its time, the American Museum, it was called. In time, he became a great publisher, in fact, the greatest for his particular period in America. And of him, his biographer has written, "No other publishing firm, even in proportion to its size, published so many works of native production between 1787 and 1824. And thus, at a time in the history of the American Republic, when our beginning literature needed encouragement, it got this encouragement from an Irish publisher who provided not only spiritual, but that very important kind of encouragement that we all need from time to time, economic encouragement. Now, the 19th century is a very interesting period for the study of immigration, whether it be Irish or of any other sort. But by 1850, half of the foreign-born population of this country was Irish. And this had its repercussions, of course. Any sudden change, even if it's a sudden change of temperature, disturbs us and brings about its own reactions. And the same thing happened here, with so many Irish prominent amongst the foreigners. We find, for instance, that they were taken advantage of in the labor market. They were exploited as cheap labor. And of course, this didn't win for them the goodwill of the ordinary laboring man. And secondly, of course, a religious problem was introduced, because they came, for the most part, as Catholics. And this sudden inundation of the eastern seaboard by not only a foreign population, but a population of another religion, posed its own problems. We can hardly believe today that the Irish of the mid-19th century were treated in a way that's somewhat reminiscent of the way in which the Negro has been treated in our own time. But there were signs in connection with job openings. No Irish need apply. In some instances, Irish homes were stoned. The churches associated with the Irish, in one or two instances, were even set afire. Be that as it may, and we're glad that it's all over, by the Civil War, the Irish had, one might say, by their patience, won at least acceptance. And that Civil War divided them just as it divided everyone else. Even in music, Maryland, My Maryland was written actually to the rhythms of an Irish poem called Caraman, O Caraman. The Union song, When Johnny Comes Marching Home, was written by Patrick Sarsfield Gilmore, a Dublin bandmaster in General Butler's army. There were Irish brigades that fought, for instance, on the Union side. There were Irish soldiers who fought on the Confederate side. Eventually, that war was over, but not before some of these Irish brigades had left a colorful remnant, if you will, a colorful trail. One of those Irish brigades had enrolled in it the 69th Regiment of New York, which had a recruiting poster that would make you think it might have been for the Irish Army. Well, the war, thank God, ended. And as the nation recovered, and as peacetime pursuits became of prime importance to the nation, we might list the Irish-born businessmen and other builders of the nation. Eugene Comiskey, for instance, who became the first publisher of Catholic books in the United States. Michael Cudahy from County Kilkenny, who in the 1870s introduced the refrigeration of meats to our economy. And his name, of course, is well known to you today. Then Alexander Stewart, a great merchant in New York, who started as a peddler of Irish laces. Then we might mention William Grace, who built the Grace lines, the Grace steamship lines, and afterwards became mayor of New York. We might mention James Butler, who came to this city, to this country, penniless, and built here the first great national chain store system. We might mention John Mackay, who founded the Postal Telegraph Cable Company. We might mention Marcus Daly, who was called Mr. Montana because of his promotion of Anaconda copper. We might mention people like Gregg, whom you know as the Gregg shorthand man. We might mention Holland, an inventor who produced the first successful American submarine. We might even go on to mention Irish labor leaders. But the list can become quite long. And in fairness, we ought to indicate that there were other areas in which the Irish worked, and some in which they didn't work so well, as for instance in the arts. There may be a reason for that. In fact, there is historically, but it isn't my purpose now to explain it to you. I might mention they did better in the drama. John Brewham, for instance, and an actor and an author of classical parodies. Dion Boucicault, the author of 300 farces, comedies, melodramas, and actually a most important man in the development of the touring company play. We might mention John Drew, the father of the most famous stage family in America, and the grandfather of the Barrymores. Of course, then we might mention another Irish actor father, James O'Neill, whose son, Eugene O'Neill, certainly needs no introduction to you, but of whom, for instance, we might say, in O'Neill's words, it was seeing the Irish players that gave me a glimpse of my opportunity. O'Neill himself never forgot the fact that his father was Irish. We might mention that the Irish, supposedly with a flair for language, produced two of the great figures in modern journalism. We have, for instance, Peter Collier, the immigrant from County Carlow, who built the Weekly and the Encyclopedia, but even more interestingly, who peddled books from door to door in the belief that the mass of people were entitled to an education and could get it by themselves. In the last 30 years of his business, he sold over 60 million books, 6 million copies alone of Dickens. And all this was done on the installment plan. We might mention Samuel McClure, another Irish journalist who founded the first newspaper syndicate. But I should like, possibly out of bias, because I myself am an educator, or at least a teacher, I should like to mention a very interesting man, Thomas Hunter, who had to leave Ireland because he too was a rebel, fleeing from the British rule which he had insulted, as it were. Coming to New York City, he was put on as a trial teacher because, after all, as a foreigner, he couldn't simply be expected to be terribly well prepared. And yet this man, who went from one position of responsibility to another, eventually establishing in New York a normal college for the preparation of teachers, a college which later became the first free college for women, and now known as Hunter College, gave to the development of American education a great deal of his energy and not a few of his enthusiasms. He supported adult education, education for women, tenure rights for teachers, and so on. Now, possibly the aspect of Irish activity in America with which most of you are familiar is the growth and development of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church grew as the immigrants grew in numbers in this country. And since the Irish were the predominant numbers of immigrants in the earlier half of the 19th century, we expect to find the Irish disproportionately represented amongst the Irish Catholic prelates and hierarchy in general. And this is exactly what happens. In 1836, for instance, 92% of the priests in New York and part of New Jersey were Irish. And if we study the roster or the list of American bishops from 1789 to 1935, we may be amazed to discover that 60% of them were either Irish-born or had Irish fathers. Many of these Irish-born bishops were pioneers in opening up new sections of the country. John Ireland in St. Paul, John England, for instance, in Charleston, Peter Kenrick in St. Louis, and so it goes. The Irish in America bore the brunt of a great deal of the religious feeling that was directed against other immigrant groups who happened also to be Catholic. Indeed, the Know-Nothings, whom you may recall from history as having been the chief anti-Catholic agitators, had, it was said with grim humor, this motto: life, liberty, and the pursuit of Irishmen. Well, Europe's difficulty has really been America's opportunity. The people of the whole world, not merely Europe, have built here a new country and a new civilization. They have left their own lands to take advantage of the opportunity offered by that golden door. They have come in by the light of that lamp. Among these has been the Irish, a people with an ancient civilization, with an ancient language, and an ancient culture, despoiled of their own lands, of their own government at home. They came and they gave generously. We don't say they gave more than others, but we say they gave as well as others. And we think it's right today that in appreciating the contribution to America of all from Europe, we say a special word of appreciation for these, the Irish. America belongs to the immigrants, and amongst those is the group known as the Irish.
Ireland Rediscovered is produced by KTCA TV, Twin Cities Area Educational Television Corporation. The next title in this series is The Irish of the Southern Cross. Host and lecturer is Dr. John McKiernan.